Hello and welcome to the final session of the concept of acceleration with Nick Land. I'm going to pass the mic off to him now.
Okay, thanks, Theo, and thanks to everyone who's here. I'm sure everyone shares my confidence that we're going to neatly wrap up all the things we've been talking about in this session. I've got I think there's actually three sort of threads running into this one, and I'm going to assume that that somehow they're going to converge. I think mostly comes from Amy as the request that we end up with a discussion of time knottiness. I definitely think we should do that. The second is last week's, we got into a kind of, I don't know whether I should call it digressionary, but we wandered into lots of sort of concrete recent political history stuff, and I think certainly some people wanted us to carry on with that. So that's also something that I think is kind of hanging over us, and we might want to pursue further today. And the third thing, which is basically comes from me as a sense of obligation, which I honestly don't think I'm going to be able to fulfill very well, is to spend some time talking about the extremely super recent accelerationist developments that have been weirdly happening, I think, with this class. It mostly goes under the kind of unconditional accelerationist label, and the person to bully about that obviously would be Vincent, who I think has gone AWOL. So that's perhaps reason for some pessimism, even greater pessimism than I already had, that we'd be able to address that. My sense really is that this is something that's going into another, to my mind, extremely fascinating wave of cultural process that all we're seeing right now is the initiation, the triggering of that, and it's going to be something going forward that we've perhaps been lucky enough to catch a glimpse of. But certainly it belongs here to the degree that we're able to capture it, which is perhaps limited. And I should just throw in, no doubt, a sort of fourth point, that any of the multiple open threads of discussion that we've had so far over this couple of months, this is going to be our chance to at least pursue them a little further, if not do anything, tie a nice neat knot in the end of it. So I think, you know, in a succession of increasingly whoa. Sorry, I don't know when my audio just went berserk for everyone else. Yeah, so in a succession of increasingly ragged sort of prefatory remarks, I'm going to probably exceed myself in raggedness today, and just basically introduce one little well, I'm going to say something ridiculous. Okay, I'm going to say one little topic. I mean, every element of that description is utterly misleading and to the point of complete ridicule and self-parody. So I'll walk that back a little bit, but I'll launch something that is a candidate for a kind of nutshell response to this question, which I hope has at least been intermittently operating through this course, about what is the basic transpartisan, basic fundamental concept of acceleration, in the sense that it is relevant to accelerationism. And the candidate that I want to put forward is that accelerationism is the philosophy of spiral temporality. So I'll just say a few things to try and defend that thesis, and then basically throw it over in terror to everyone in the class, and we'll see how things develop. So why would anyone at all be interested in spiral temporality? I think for reasons that have been sort of recapitulated in our discussion in this class. Because when the philosophy of time is treated in its most historically concrete context, it tends to divide into a sense of there being these two enormous cultural macro systems of time conception. To my mind, the language associated with this is always unsatisfactory, so it might need some poking around at. But it's something like linear or progressive on the one hand versus cyclic temporality on the other hand. And I see this kind of basic opposition between these two fundamental cultural formations of time thinking arising over and over again. And it's particularly interesting from the perspective of China on this, because the interpretation that is often put up on Chinese modernization in these terms is that China was forced eventually to surrender its traditional cyclic conception of temporality to a Western capitalistic, modernistic, progressive model of temporality. And you can, in quite a lot of concrete detail, discuss the sort of tortured process of China's kind of cultural accommodation to modernity using these terms, you know, offshoots of which include the adoption of the Western calendar. Sorry, I'm pausing here only because I've just gone back into this. Oh no, I don't think it's associated with our problem. So I'll forge ahead. And so in this very large kind of, it's more cultural historical, I think, than in some sort of tight sense philosophical on this level mode of discussion. The figure of the spiral is incredibly compelling because it seems to be a diagonal response to this option between two basic modes of historical and temporal thinking. The spiral is a diagonal between a cyclical and progressive model of time. I think you could alternatively say the spiral is a diagonal circuit or a prolonged diagonal. And among the features of the spiral is then the fact that it's diagonal, fractal, rhythmic, and cybernetically positive, and one that I think needs to be added, which is a synthetic element, because we're still left with the spiral. We're still left with two options, and I think the natural intuitive option is to treat it that a spiral is something that from an origin spirals outwards expansively or extensively, and that certainly to us in a certain way seems to fit a model of amplificatory positive feedback, that it's something that is both a reiterating rhythmic periodic process and also a process of amplification. But I think it's really crucial to give it its full philosophical force, to invert that sense of the spiral and to treat the spiral as involutionary. That the spiral has as its asymptote singularity. And I think that you can preserve all the things that you want to do, sort of systems dynamically with the expansive spiral, with the involutionary spiral. But what is emphasized when the spiral is spiraling inwards is something like time implosion. It's something like compressive temporality. It I think dramatizes the kind of questions that we were talking about last week, that I think at that point I attributed particularly strongly to Paul Virilio, about acceleration being understood in this ethico-political sense as a collapse of time horizons and a dehumanization, a collapse of sort of the space of decision. That pure speed leads to this compression to a point of impossibility, decision making, and therefore intrinsically to an ethico-political crisis. A little phrase that I think is really worth recalling here, because it's very evocative, but I think it's something that has to be again turned upside down or twisted or turned inside out, which is that I think needs Googling more than I've yet Googled it. Because it's one of these, it has an anonymous source, but it's treated as something that captures a sort of dilemma of the kind of neoconservative epoch of Western. I think it's sort of attributed implicitly to an Afghan hill warrior or one of these other challengers to the neoconservative project, which is you have the watches time. And I think this notion that the time is something that it's useful to see explicated there, because the possibility of the prospect of deep strategic political possibility seems to me fundamentally attached to this notion, we have the time. And if the rejoinder to say, no, you don't have the time. Time is collapsing, it's imploding, it's compressing, and all your expectations about the extent of ethico-political decision making need to be resituated. Space of accelerationist compression in which the walls are closing in which everything that you've been led to expect about the opportunity you have for reflection and for long-term strategic decision making are no longer historically practical, then you are in a new and I think extremely traumatic epoch, which I want to say is the epoch of acceleration. It's the epoch we're in, and I think this is ultimately at a point that approaches the transcendental structure of this political quandary. This is why our epoch, recent epoch, is so thoroughly characterized by shock and trauma. You know, the real content of that is not some particular empirical events that have happened, however disturbing they may be. It's the sense that the very space of political response is being squeezed out of existence on this involutionary spiral of techonomic acceleration that leads to a certain kind of confluence of the position of the political with an extreme panic, a time crisis. So actually, I think that's me done in introductory mode on this, and I should just go straight to open the whole thing up for our last chance to turn these things over.
I'm happy to jump in if
Yes.
If you can hear me, which because I've not got a microphone.
No, I can hear you really well.
Cool.
I don't know about everyone else.
So is this conception of time of accelerationism dependent on acceptance of the idea of a singularity? This is something that is sort of destined to happen, and that will, when it happens, have this sort of, you know, the effects that it is sort of traditionally said to have. I'm just wondering.
Yes.
It seems as if it's being assumed, or you know, or sort of taken for granted that as an end goal, as if we get there, it'll definitely sort of happen.
Yes. Well, I think there's several elements to this. I mean, look, peeling back your question from the end, I think if idea whatsoever about what the singularity is supposed to bring with it, or you know, the associations we have, or I can't remember exactly the way you formulated this, but if there is some positive conception or idea of singularity, I think the notion is being misunderstood, because singularity is just the horizon beyond which one cannot see. Like Werner Vinge's line on it, I think, is absolutely excellent, that it's a wall across the future. So it's just a limit. It's just a limit. And this is why then I think we get to peeling down to the just previous level of your question. And this is big, so I'm going to have to just try and control myself a little bit and maybe leave certain things suggestive here. But I think Kurzweil is an extremely interesting figure like this, because what is the difference between, there's a really crucial difference at stake here, which is really the difference, if we're going to just treat it in the coldest geometrical sense, the difference between an exponential and hyperbolic curve. And an exponential curve doesn't ever, it doesn't have a singularity. There's no natural tendency to it. You know, so Kurzweil's whole construction is that, you know, stuff keeps doubling and doubling and doubling and doubling, but stuff can double. I mean, you know, there are physical limits or all of these empirical factors that could limit it, but conceptually or philosophically, there's nothing about an exponential trend that implies singularity at all. Whereas a hyperbolic trend actually does reach singularity, actually reaches vertical. And I think, yeah, I think this Theo's stuff is totally right. I think if you want to, it's very crudely but I think suggestively, whether you think about some factor X doubling over some given unit of time, some period, or you see time itself compressing for some unit of change. You know, time compression is hyperbolic. I would say intensive, and some growth factor increasing in time is exponential and doesn't imply singularity. So Kurzweil is not a singularitarian in any strong sense, because he doesn't really want to push beyond exponential growth. And there's a whole lot of kind of super exponential trends that don't quite go hyperbolic. So he can occupy that space, but not reach this crisis. If you want to go hyperbolic, if you want to reach singularity, you go, as Theo says, to Zeno, where you never reach the wall, because you go half the distance to the wall and half the distance to the wall and half the distance to the wall, and you never reach the wall. That's a hyperbolic trend. That's time compression, and that does strongly necessitate singularity. And so I think the thing is, if we're starting from the position about the collapse of political decision space, then the natural tendency is to be on this hyperbolic line of time compression rather than on the softer Kurzweilian line of exponential growth of some relevant factor. I mean, sorry, you should definitely come back here, James, because I'm worried that I'm, wandering off your concern here.
Yeah. Okay. So let me. I'm still trying to wrap my head around it, really. So where does the spiral end? The spiral ends at basically at the end of this, where the hyperbolic curve reaches. It's either sort of vertical or horizontal, depending on where you.
Yes, if you're.
It's the limit. Is that?
Yes. Yes, it's the limit. It's the limit in terms of the fact that you could obviously articulate it in different ways, but on one hand, it's the zeroing out. It's the final definitive zeroing out of the space of ethico-political decision making.
Yeah, it is interesting because, I mean, I've been sort of wrestling for quite a while with the idea of sort of cyclical history versus linear history, but it really is. I mean, you say diagonal, but it's certainly something completely different from both of them. On a really sort of fundamental level. I mean, my conception sort of previously had been this idea. I sort of bought into cyclical history, but thought that perhaps sort of capitalist acceleration sort of offered a way sort of to sort of like an escape velocity, to sort of to escape the cycle. But that way of thinking about it really puts a new, totally different perspective, really, isn't it? So I'm going to tune out because I haven't gathered my thoughts, but yeah, thanks.
I think the thing is that, there's a sense of this kind of gathering triumph of a kind of linear, progressive, whatever vocabulary you want to use, history, and as I say, the Chinese story is told about them just switching across, just abandoning this cyclical notion, or it's often associated with pagan time, with a historical notion of temporality, where time is like a year that's constantly, you're moving through these seasons without a kind of definite historical gradient of any kind. So there's a kind of story about that, but it's not a very convincing story in the sense that there's this constant return of the repressed, you could say, of this cyclical conception, isn't it? And in this course, we've constantly been coming back to these various types of long waves, and that in theorizing capitalism, which is supposed to characterize the most extreme sort of modernistic type of temporality, various types of wave theories are constantly reimposing themselves, at every level. And I think it's just a sign that there's something that can't be shucked off in this kind of cyclical process. That there's a absolutely relentless necessity of cyclical thinking, and so what the spiral does is it accommodates that, it adjusts itself to the fact that time is never able to become simply non-cyclical. It sort of demonstrates its inability to become non-cyclical, and our thinking about time and history is unable to become non-cyclical. But I think in a much more productive way than some suggestion that we should just flip back to some traditional mode of the cycles of time and history, which to me, someone like Greer, to my favorite foil for this, because he's the anti-Kurzweil, he would be happy just to say, look, let's just go back to cyclical time. That seems to me just not a realistic option, and that's a kind of argument with him that I would kind of wage under the banner of the time spiral. It's just like, this is what we have, and it isn't going to simply resolve itself back into a neat sort of pagan cyclical temporality.
There's one other thing that springs to mind, which is the question of, assuming there's a spiral, it's when did it begin, or did it have a beginning, and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
And there's one thing that is brought to my mind, which is, I can't remember what the film is called, but has anyone seen the Werner Herzog film of about maybe 4 years ago? The one that was about these caves in France, where they uncovered these caves with the Neanderthal paintings, cave paintings. You should be able to Google it pretty easily. I think it was called Cave of Forgotten Dreams. But the most impressive thing that I took away from it, and that I remember from it, was it was this idea that before a certain period, time sort of greater in its scope. And he was talking about how they'd analyzed the walls of the caves and paintings, and there were these instances where someone had started a drawing on the side of the cave, and then someone, they say 10,000 years later, had come and made some more adjustments to it, had added to it. But it's like this idea that sort of over those 10,000 years, nothing really had happened. That people were living the same way and expressing themselves the same way, and whereas if you look at like the last 500 years, what's happened with art? I mean, it's bananas. It's gone so quickly. It's just almost difficult to know. I don't even know where we are now. I mean, even the last 100 years, it's accelerated hugely. But that film, it's a great film to watch because it just gives you, it puts so many things in perspective. But you almost feel that maybe those 10,000 years between the one guy, marking up the wall, drawing I don't know what, it was in France, a deer or something, and the other guy making another mark on the wall was sort of before a process had been started. It was like not pre-time, but pre-time in a sense.
Yeah.
Before the beginning of some fundamental process. I don't know. Has anyone else seen the film?
No, but it sounds great. I must see it.
I've seen it, yeah. Yeah, I'm sort of curious if we can talk a little bit about beginnings, middles, and ends in the way that James is sort of bringing up, and how that would fit into this notion of a time spiral. And then I sort of also want to bring this into the conversation about blockchain, because blockchain obviously has this beginning, middle, end structure in terms of from a peer to another peer. So it has a directional flow.
Yes. Yeah, but what I think is really great about the spiral is the line is a line. I mean, it's not that you're abandoning linear temporality. You continually move forward along the timeline. All of that is preserved. It's just that the line is itself fractal, diagonal, involutionary, cybernetically positive. I mean, you're not. It's completely consistent with the most relentless asymmetric time gradient. So it doesn't seem to me that there's a problem about the fact that these, blockchain temporality is successive and linear and all of this. Fine, totally. That's something that the line of the spiral would be, or the line of a non-spiral. If you want to argue against the spiral, of course, that it's not that it rules that out, but it's not the case that demonstrating temporal linearity is an anti-spirodynamic argument. It's completely neutral on that. Yeah, I just have to confess, look, I mean, it might be that everything really goes dead. I'll be able to catch up with the sidebar, but that seems to me hopeful in the extreme. So I hope that people are going to try and throw that stuff arena rather than go complete parallel processing on it.
Yeah, if people could scroll up to their favorite questions and read them out in the Hangout space, that'd be great.
I've got a question following on from Theo's mention of blockchain time. Because when we started talking about time a few weeks ago, it kind of was based on Vince's question on Twitter, which was something like, how do you reconcile teleoplexy, the blockchain, and templexity?
Right.
And I think you responded something like that's as difficult as trying to explain Fermat's last theorem in a tweet, which is interesting because then I just caught up and read that Ted Chiang story, which is awesome.
Yes.
And the model of time that is being proposed there is like what Theo was kind of alluding to right at the start, a sort of point outside of time. From what I know, Hugh Price talks about it as an archimedial point.
Right.
And kind of corresponds to this, like fundamental physics, Minkowski space idea of symmetrical time, or really just space.
Yes.
It might, because this kind of just occurred to me yesterday. Correct me if I'm wrong on this, because I don't know Heidegger at all, but what he calls Abgescheidenheit when he was writing about Trackle, which obviously you've written about. Which would, I suppose, be completely antithetical to this idea of asymmetrical time that we're talking about now in relationship to modernity and accelerationism.
Right.
So if Fermat's last theorem can kind of like somehow give you an explanation of why, of how you can reconcile templexity, teleoplexy, and blockchain time, does that mean that sitting behind, like as a kind of at the most abstract level, the theory of time that modernity unfolds in with its like perhaps linear progressive enlightenment moment, its cyclical pagan moment before it, all of these different temporalities, blockchain time, which we're heading towards, which is a kind of absolute tense time, or perhaps you could argue a transcendental. I don't know, that might be a little bit of a big one to throw out there. Do they all sit inside symmetrical time?
Well,
You get me?
yeah, I think this is obviously a great and extremely complicated question. I mean, look, I'll just go with my own extremely half-baked intuitions and just hope this whole thing spirals, you know, because my sense of this is that asymmetric time and is just time. So that side of the modernist project that Hugh Price brilliantly represents is really an attempt to completely exterminate the concept of time. And his antithesis is someone like Heidegger. I mean, I think Heidegger is just a kind of, you know, in this respect, is just a kind of nominal name that you put on that position that holds onto the transcendental problem of time as we've inherited it from Kant. So, you know, there's nothing special or magical about it. It's just the refusal of the dissolution of that centuries-old transcendental time problem, in which time is not space. There's a distinct form of intuition that is assigned to time because of the fact that time is essentially asymmetric. And I think, you know, Hugh Price is just basically wanting to say, and he's got a massive kind of tide of modernity behind him of a certain kind. He's just saying, look, let's just kill time. It's just an embarrassment. We don't need it. Everything, this asymmetric, you know, I would say from his perspective, this asymmetric bullshit can just be kind of edited out by the fundamental trend of science that has been in certain respects just confused and misguided by certain, you know, by his mind, very confused interpretations of thermodynamics and quantum mechanics that suggest, he thinks erroneously, the persistence of some symmetry. So I just want to say about this, look, you know, at least admit that you're trying to eliminate time. And transcendental philosophy just is basically so much the opposite. It's basically folding everything into time. And you just have to eat the fact that time is asymmetry intrinsically. It's tensed. If you don't have tense, just stop talking about time. This whole you know, A series, B series type nonsense is nonsense. Like, if you know, there is no such thing as tenseless time. If you're saying time is just a dimension, spatialized it totally, and time has disappeared in the sense that anyone with any commitment to transcendental philosophy should be willing to accept. So yeah, just final comment then. So in saying that there is a kind of that the blockchain is fundamentally tensed. that asymmetry is the whole of what it's about, and that asymmetry is the really deep current of cryptography that is captured by Bitcoin, because asymmetric cryptography is also the same. The whole usage of a trapdoor function that you can get in more easily than you can get out. That the whole of contemporary cryptography is based on the usage of that, and that is what temporality is about. I'll just say, sorry, just one tiny more, just to confuse it a little bit more, is that the distinction between the synthetic and the analytic is also about this. That the distinction between the synthetic and the analytic ultimately rests in cryptography, in the sense that the synthetic is that which takes work, and the analytic is that which at least comparatively doesn't take work. So it's the difference between a solution and checking a solution. And that difference between a solution and checking a solution is what all of cryptography is based on. That you can, in the most simple sense, you can multiply together. You can find the product of two large primes vastly more simply than you can then, once you have the product of two large primes, factorize that number to extract the two large primes. That is the model of modern cryptography, and I think it should be our definition of what the analytic synthetic distinction is about. That basically analysis is checking and synthesis is production. And so cryptography, I think, is the great ally on the defense of time against these trends that Hugh Price brilliantly represents, towards the annihilation of time, its dissolution into space, as one particular very influential telos of modern science. I don't know. Have I just totally lost your question here? Because I mean,
no. You answered it actually perfectly, the way I hoped you were going to. Theo and I have been kind of talking about this the last couple of hours, trying to figure out which is the reigning theory of time. And that kind of like makes a couple of things interesting. But the question that I think both of us are really interested in is, obviously, you then have to throw out. Well, actually, maybe a better way to phrase this question is, how then does determinism operate? Because in the symmetrical theory of time, it's completely locked down. There is no possibility for free will. And I think that Dr. Banks in the Chang stories is really great at kind of giving a sort of like pop explanation of this, in that it's just not relevant. It's just a different kind of perspective. Free will isn't a meaningful kind of concept in that concept of time. But it is obviously in asymmetrical time, because it seems like a spontaneous way of apprehending what is coming at us as a kind of a space of nothingness, like at the top of my screen right now. So if we're going to say that there is some kind of aspect of fatalism in tensed asymmetric time, in the terms of, like you've just given, with a spiral involution, that is the model of accelerationism, what exactly is its status? Is it a sort of, is it strong fatalism, like absolute predestination? Or is it, which means that you then have no space for like novelty or chance or, I don't know, surprise individuations or something? Or is it a kind of like weaker determinism in the way that it's used, like in cybernetics, where you have a kind of system that needs to have a noise input? It sort of has a kind of basis in chaos, but then it develops a tendency and moves towards an attractor. And so you have a sort of systemic tendency, which is seen as a kind of determinism, but it's not fully realized teleologically in the way that there's a kind of end already proposed that is pulling everything towards it. What is the status of fate in terms of asymmetrical accelerationist time?
Yes, good question.
I just want to say that I just wanted to happen and say something really quick, that statistical determinism seems like the only type of determinism that we're offered after Hume's like damning problematic of induction. But unless Nick wants to say something different, that's my understanding of
Look, okay, I'm going to just take a step back because I think it might take a little while to reach the summit of Amy's question, and I take it yours here, Theo, which is that determinism. If you're looking for determinism, strong Laplacian determinism, you have to go with Hugh Price, surely. Like that's the only basis of the neat determinist story. Is if you have rigid determinism, you must have symmetrical time, because rigid determinism means that it makes just as much sense to proceed from an effect back to a cause as from a cause to an effect. There's complete symmetry in it, and the notion of asymmetric temporality must necessarily complicate that kind of notion of temporality. Yes, it's Parmenidean. Perhaps, I mean, it's only to flatter Parmenides a little bit because I think you get a bit more in the modern period with Laplace and mechanistic determinism. You get something a little bit more definite in what is being said about that determinism means. So I would expect, that there is a kind of alliance. If there is an alliance at all, the alliance is going to be between all of these notions, and how they bundle is obviously going to be complex, of free will, spontaneity, chance, all of the sort of dissident terms in relation to strict determinism are going to have to align themselves with tensed or asymmetric temporality. That's their only hope. That if all of those notions are we know that they are going to disappear in fully tenseless Hugh Price block universe, post basically geometrized temporality or extinguished temporality. We know they're going to go. So if they have any chance at all to hang on, it's going to have to be on this tensed time path. But I would be very reluctant to then take the step that they are in some strong sense therefore automatically vindicated by tensed temporality. I mean, I think that we then are faced with the question, the tendency of which, if we're going to just take Heidegger as an example, or maybe other people, Bergson, who I know much less about, would probably be just as good for this. The tendency has always been to massively sort of humanize and anthropomorphize tense temporality, and produce some extremely strong alliance between the meaning of the human and the meaning of this kind of original temporality, that therefore treats almost as coincidental a notion of free will and a notion of tensed temporality. That seems to me deeply questionable, and the reason to talk about the blockchain is precisely to say, look, we have no reason at all to think that the natural locus of tense time is man, even if that's our traditional inclination. So that's obviously just like, you know, glancing off this question, but
is it enough to just kind of say that if you take like a general entropic universe as your basis, and then you kind of describe moments of like you have like an ontology of difference. You do have moments of individuation as moments of intensified negative entropy. That the determinism in that exists, but it's weak in the systemic cybernetic sense because it's articulated as attractors or a kind of systemic tendency rather than hard determinism. So you still have this kind of like inhuman effect of there is some other order which is thinking through you. You're not completely free, but you do have some kind of leverage. So sort of it like the way that I've brought this up like 100 times in these things. So sorry, but like Deleuze's description of the eternal return, where you have two moments. You have the moment of the two dice throw, or the two moments of the dice throw. Theo, you know this as well, I think. So if I get it wrong, let me know. First one hits the sky, and the number turns up. No, sorry, the first one hits the ground. The number turns up. That's the number of fate. If you affirm that, which is, I guess, all of the constraints that exist, the dice then moves to the dance floor of the sky, I think is the term Deleuze uses. And then that's where you get another throw or something like that. Yeah, if you affirm the fatal number, the dice rolls again. And so you affirm chance as a whole. And you get these two kind of moments, one of like having to accept what is determined, and in affirming that you get a kind of moment of chance. So it's kind of like just agreeing or accepting constraints, whatever they are, acknowledging them, and not resenting them. And then then you get a kind of another dice throw. So you get another set of like determined numbers, but you don't know what they are yet. So there's a kind of like chance, fate, motor happening in this like description of individuation, which ends up, right, like Theo kind of becoming the virtual later on. I don't know, but like, is that kind of weaker sense of fate as a kind of like systemic determination like useful in any way?
I don't know though. That's really difficult, because like useful is what, you know, what are people trying to do? Sorry, that's terrible. I have to just also backtrack from that, because you know what people are trying to do is exactly what we're trying to sort of situate, isn't it, in this whole question? Like, you know, what are the actual subjects and agents and well springs of chance and spontaneity? You know, if we're going to try and jump in and say negative entropy, but obviously, like, from the perspective of transcendental philosophy, time as such is the kind of is the fundament of fate. You know, fate isn't something that happens. Fate isn't something that happens primarily in time. You know, that fate and destination is the fact that there is time. So I'm just, I guess I'm trying to be a bit cautious about the fact that the power of these kind of scientific models of the notion of some naive cosmology, you know, of sort of entropic and negotropic processes and all of that, it's all very beautiful, but it tends to kind of diffuse this kind of hard transcendental point about time as such. Time as such, which is absolute rigid destiny. It's rigid destiny because of the fact that it's not then that any attempt to kind of correct or modify or qualify time cannot, that could be imagined in time, is just sheer metaphysics. You know it has to be metaphysics. There cannot be anything that happens in time that qualifies time. You know, the time, once time is there, then it's too late for anybody to kind of do anything about it, to do anything about time as such. That would be a completely sort of sad metaphysical error. So then the question is about chronogenesis, the production of time. Yes. What about producing time? Where does time come from? That's where fate is engineered. And so, you know, that's where I want to transpose these residual questions that have come out of the tradition about human agency and all of this kind of thing. If Heidegger kind of, and those guys, that what became, I think, the kind of increasingly the snowball humanism that happened to the tradition of transcendental philosophy, tempted ever more to go the whole hog, at least at a certain point, and say, you know, let's just buy this thing that man produces time. Only insofar as man produces time can man be free. Can this language of freedom make any sense? You know, it's because the transcendental subject of temporalization is man, that man is a free, spontaneous being. But I am only going to just say I just don't think that's even an option really now. I mean, I find it a kind of comical response to the kind of thing we're trying to deal with. And it's certainly like, why on earth would we think that was the answer to the question of chronogenesis? I have no idea.
Well, beyond just like man specifically, you know, eventually in like his latest or his last seminars and lectures, he kind of more sees it in terms of technology, of techniques, right? And it's the issue of cause and how you produce causality. And I was sort of saying before that even when you geometrize, like quote unquote space-time, in the Minkowski metric, you still have this fundamental, the triangular inequality is what defines the difference between space-like, time-like, and light-like intervals. And it defines it, I mean, it is written mathematically in terms of sort of the brute fact of the constancy of the speed of light. But what it defines is a causal difference. The ability of things to be causally related, or for the causal relation to hold, which is true everywhere the interval is time-like or light-like, and then the space-like is described as that which is causally dissociated, like two things that cannot be part of the same causal formation.
Right.
Sort of like fundamentally, like what you're saying about the telos of modern science is that it defines a type of causality and rules out a certain kind, which is like, you know, the sort of attractor dynamic system thing we're talking about, wherein two things that are at a space-like interval from each other can still have like a prior relation by virtue of the attractors that they're both going to be part of. Whereas in the Minkowski space-time, by reference to another inequality, another asymmetry, a different kind of causal picture is produced. And I guess, like, I don't know, what is the commonality between those two asymmetries, between the triangular inequality that defines a light cone, that defines causal and temporal relationship, even in geometrized, you know, that reintroduces tense into tenseless time, and the asymmetry that we're talking about, like whether it's artificial in the blockchain or, you know, ecstatic as in Heidegger or something like that. Like, is it simply like belongingness together, like some proto-causal, like when we talk about this asymmetry, are we always already talking about cause before we're talking about kinds of time, and this is sort of like the question concerning technology. Like, he defines the Greek cause, aition, as belongingness together. And I mean, do you think that looking back at this from the later Heidegger and in terms of causation rather than firstly time, that we sort of get some traction on what's going on in the emergence of science from tense to time? Or that it's a technological thing that happens there, and this is sort of key to the production of time, quote unquote, production of time.
So can I just push you a bit further? Like, how are you thinking of the relation of the notion of causality and the notion of production in the sense specifically of the production of time?
Well, so like, say like in one instance or in one case, the attractor, the positive attractor produces a relationship between two things, even if they are at a space-like interval from each other, and it is the production of the relationship of those two things in some specific conformation. But then similarly, it's like, so in the case of a light cone in Minkowski space-time, it's like you have some observer, some interaction, some vector, something like that is what has a light cone. It's slicing out, it's sliced, because so otherwise, like, and there's a hierarchy of like causal conditions. And the least, like the degree 0 of causal consistency in a space-time is called being non-totally vicious. And it means that there is that you can specify some point in that time or some interaction in that space-time which is not the cause of itself. And you can specify that it is not the cause of itself. And so produces this like potential for this asymmetry, which is the potential for description. And so it's the description from the point of view of that interaction or that vector or something like that, which is able to carve like a sort of beacon or slice of causal consistency out of the totally vicious, which is everything is the cause of itself. Everything is causally related already, and you can't like carve out a specific causal path in this like totally vicious manifold.
Right.
And so it's an issue of like, again, like whether, man, in both of them, it seems like you have this issue of man or technology creating time as like a causal condition, like as carving a something out of the all nothing from the inside.
So yeah, can I just ask, which I'm going to take as partly this, can you give me again the source of this extremely fascinating language, totally vicious manifold? That's a...
One second. Yeah, so it's originally owed to Lorentz, not Minkowski. Here's the wiki. Causality conditions, and like the first one is, and I linked it specifically to the section non-totally vicious. So it's just like the non-totally vicious, is just like for some points P in M in the metric of space-time, there is some P which does not hold the causal relationship to itself. And if there is any such point in a manifold, then you have like the least condition, or the condition of like least possible causal consistency from the perspective of geometrized time and causality and so forth. And just like the fact that, in this math, there's a sort of common mathematical, or there's a common basis in mathematical description of the chronological relation and the causal relation. And like similarly, that seems to be the case in intense time, like once and then once again, like first of all, in the sense of man being this point where that man's specific history is sort of the determination of its futures, and vice versa. And then once again, where we have this idea of like ontotechnology, of like a transcendental production of time in something like in the figure of man or in the blockchain or something itself. And then you have sort of the same once and once again in science, where you have like this definition of the causal relation alongside the chronological, and then you have like the distinction of a light cone from the surrounding metric of the universe that an observer implies, or that this like possibility of a causal and chronological condition relation implies. I don't know, there's just like there's a common like abstract structure in terms of the relationship of causality, chronology, and description, I guess, or the possibility of description that seems to be going on in different ways, and productive artificial ways, in some sense artificial, in both cases, sort of a triangular relationship that is fundamentally asymmetric in structure.
Yeah, I mean, this is obviously difficult stuff. I mean, it's highly suggestive to me, but in a way that at the moment is so fuzzy that I think I would just embarrass myself by trying to push very far into. I mean, like if I was trying to put cosmophysics onto the blockchain, I would start with this discussion, you know, but I don't see that as a kind of facile undertaking. Although, I mean, you know, I'm more hopeful about it after what you've said than I would have been half an hour ago. That's for sure. Yeah.
Is what you're trying to do talk about how there is some space for like actual causal change inside symmetrical time models? Is that kind of what you're saying, or am I just?
Yeah. Symmetrical, like geometrized time is just a setting for the description or the picking out of light cone, of the light cone of an observer or an event or something like that. Because like as soon as you geometrize space-time, you shift to that register of description, you immediately have to reintroduce asymmetry in the form of these like inequalities that define what like the difference between things that could be causally related, which is the inside of the light cone, and things time-like relations, and things that can't be, which is space-like intervals outside of the light cone. And I mean, when I was first like taught this, the teacher was like, "This is why time travel." Like he wrote the inequality on the board, and it's like, "This is why time travel is impossible." This defines like intervals that can be traversed, and intervals that can't be. And like space-like intervals, obviously, like being the ones that. Shit, I'm kind of losing the thread here slightly. I'm super hungover, but yeah, it's like you in order to describe anything at all, you have to immediately reintroduce inequality, and the point of geometrizing the causal and chronological relationships in this way is to like what someone from this perspective might say about teleology is that if we can have causal relationships between things that are separated by a space-like interval, then everything is potentially, like any event in the future has a causal relationship with every single event in the past. And you can't pick out which ones there's a causal relationship and which ones aren't. Like, you know, a piece of dust falling on Mars and a thing happening in the Andromeda Galaxy are equally and inseparably causally related to anything that happens in the future of the universe. And so we have no basis on which to define causal differences and pick out what's causally relevant and what's not. And that is like that's the non-totally vicious thing. Is like as soon as you have like hard and absolute transcendental teleology, then the physicist would say it's totally vicious. Every point in space-time is the cause of itself, and we can't pick out anything causally. And this is sort of, I think, like Nick's point that this is like the whole telos of modern science, comes clearly to the fore. Is that modern science is made possible by this like formalization of the picking out of causal factors and being able to distinguish that which is causally related from that which is not. And that's why I'm sort of implying that like it almost seems as if like between the two, tensed and tenseless, or at least between the differentiation of one from the other, it's really causality, it's causation that's at stake rather than time. And then I was relating that to Heidegger because like in the question concerning technology, you know, that's where he starts is like Aristotelian, their Aristotelian causes is like a technical manifold of causality, whose like common nature, the aition of cause in Greek, is belongingness together, and which is like originarily a technological thing that equally founds physics and pre-modern time or pre-modern causality.
But causality would only be intelligible if you had an absolutely flawless map of the whole.
Yeah, that's an interesting way of putting it. Or I guess like you would only be able to have causal description. I mean, according to the physicist, like, or in mathematical terms, you'd only be able to have causal description in tensed time if you had whose demon is it who like knows the absolute state of the universe in the given moment? Laplace's demon. I think like absolute knowledge.
I didn't even know Laplace had a demon, but if he did, that would definitely be it, isn't it?
Yeah, he does. The Laplace demon knows. I know he'd create like a webcomic about Laplace's demon.
Yeah.
That's
totally. So Laplace's demon is weirdly is an agent for the extinction of time because all he has to know is the state of every particle in the universe at any arbitrary time, and all the rest is completely implied. So the temporal development of the universe adds no information to this demon whatsoever because of strict determinism.
Right, and then but like the impossibility of like the thermodynamic impossibility of Laplace's demon actually existing is simultaneously what gives rise like to the intuition of this new inequality that you have to reintroduce into modern physics that defy, because like no actual entity can have total knowledge of space and time, and so that like that kind of lack or impossibility is now what like redefines tensed time,
because you're giving Laplace's demon a photonic brain, and then it loses track of all the space-like differences that can't be processed.
Right.
Photonic intelligence.
And it's like it's interesting along these lines, along Amy's lines, to think that like Laplace's demon could only be the universe, or even like even were it possible, like the most possible version of it is the universe itself. Like the universe as like a photonic brain or like a faster than light brain. Like Laplace's demon would have to be the universe perceiving itself as a whole, which is kind of this whole like omega point, like Tiplerite teleology, right? Like we're already in like the crushed end of everything, simulating all of its possible pasts.
Right. But no, but okay. Yeah, I'm going to duck out of this a minute because I don't want to hog this, but I just have to ask one question about this, because if you could have this kind of Tiplerite solution to it, and this has been haunting what you've been saying, Jake, in terms of this kind of attractor state, aren't you actually folding everything back into a light cone? You know, there is that the photonic brain at a certain point is, you know, the universe is actually basically imploding into a light cone, isn't it? Or it's imploding into a photonic intelligence as it approaches a kind of particular singularity.
Yeah, and it's only in states of spatial singularity, of total implosion, that Laplace's demon or this like self-sentient universe photonic brain is possible at all, because you have to have like zero space-like separation in order for like totally vicious conditions to now apply. And in that case, the entire universe is now just the historic light cone, which is just the light cone in the past direction, all the things that might be causally relevant to the interaction, which is instantaneously happening now, of this omega point. Yeah. Which is just insanity, but, you know, has to be at least considered. Laplace's God.
Yeah, that's a good slogan for a t-shirt, actually. It's insanity, but it has to be considered. Hunter, go. It's the fact I'm seeing you a sign that you're about to speak, because if so, please do.
Well, it's I mean, if there's no more on this particular topic, I have kind of a simple question about the relationship between this concept of transcendental asymmetrical time and the concept of hyperbolic process towards a singularity of absolute deterritorialization or whatever. Like how do those two notions do they entail one another, or how are they related? Like why is transcendental time leading towards a singularity, or is that a contingent event, or is that sort of part of the fabric of transcendental time?
Yeah, that's also a good question, because I mean, look, there's a facile answer to it, but I think in the very dissatisfaction that will arise from that will explode the complexity of your question, which is that the existence of time is already a demonstration of singularity. I mean, you know, we have time in some sense. So, sorry, I'm still recovering slightly from Laplace's demon here. Okay, let me just rephrase the question again. And yeah, which is, so what's the connection between between tense time, tense transcendental time, and historical singularity? And I think that you know, how do we make sense of the fact that there is critique? Or as we were talking about in previous weeks, there's this whole, I think, sort of, you know, intertranslatable, substitutable series of, you know, modes of articulation of modernity as singularity. You know, I think we can run the whole thing through Protestant Christianity. We can run it all through critique. We can run it all through capitalism. There might be more that have just sort of escaped me momentarily. Or what they all share is a structure of singularity, in the sense that all of them are implicitly limit phenomena, that constantly the historical temptation has been to presuppose in each case some mode of exceeding the dynamic of this phenomenon, to exceed critique, you know, to try and enter the zone of post-critique, post-capitalism, post-Protestantism, as if we could sort of draw some boundary on these phenomena short of this ultimate limit, this final horizon. So the fact that we're in modernity, or we're in this kind of, you know, I think you can translate perfectly between Protestant phenomenon or a nihilistic phenomenon, where we're in the history of nihilism, we're in critique, we're in capitalism. All of those things are to say that singularity is already a kind of operative condition. It's not some kind of a speculative projection. It's already implicit in the process that we're engaged in. Now, why is that particularly related to tensed temporality? Well, tense temporality or the gradient of time sorry, I'm in danger of just being sort of tautologically dogmatic about it. I will just complete this phrase and step back and see what other people say, and then perhaps come back on this, because it's obviously great. But sort of, I think my hazardously dogmatic formulation of this is just that tense temporality simply is the expression of a temporal relation to singularity. Like, as soon as you, it cannot be, you cannot construct that relation, you cannot construct that history through an asymmetrical physical model. In Hugh Price's sense of physics, in terms of completely symmetrical physical formula, there cannot be a model of modernity that is expressed in terms of perfectly symmetrical processes, because there cannot be a tendential process towards singularity within symmetrical physical description. So I think that's on one level the hinge between that. But as I say, I think I should step back on this, because I'm not being impressively articulate about it right at the moment.
Well, yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say I don't understand the answer, really. Or I mean, why does tense time have to be a temporality
related to singularity?
Singularity, yeah. I'm just kind of asking the question again, but
yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Okay. Let's see whether there's a good way to approach this. I think that there probably are several. Coming at the question from transcendental philosophy, the question is this: like, time as such is obviously not something that is that can be processed as something that is kind of unfolding in time. That is the absolute definition of metaphysics, is to treat time as something in time. So that still leaves certain responses open, and as I said, I think the predominant scientific trend, I think Hugh Price sees more deeply on a more philosophical level what science as a whole tends to assume is that the solution to that problem is to actually extinguish time through the scientific enterprise, and to end up with a series of completely reversible equations that mean that all you have is a geometric frame in which physical processes, completely reversible physical processes, unfold deterministically meaning reversibly, and actually time is something like a kind of just optical effect that emerges from that. It has no scientific consequence at all. Or to put it into the terms that are sort of at stake in Jake's line of question, there's no actual causal implication about time as such. Time as such is merely a perspective on causation. It's not a causal factor or consequence. So what obviously you can't think, what cannot be a scientific thought, if you take this line, is the production of time is not something that's systematically unthinkable. It has to be unthinkable. It's meaningless, because by putting time at the level of production, by making time a factor or output of production, it brings time, it flattens causality onto time, or time onto causality. That, it's a complete breach with the promise of the scientific enterprise in this sense. Now, so we then go to transcendental philosophy. Transcendental philosophy is nothing but the question of the original production of time. It's something that in a scientific universe of the kind that we get at the end. I'm going to keep treating Hugh Price as the model of this because he's just so elegant in his determination to philosophically complete the mainstream scientific enterprise. In that model, there cannot be transcendental philosophy. It's simply impossible. Transcendental philosophy must itself be an illusion, because there cannot be a sense given to the notion of the production of time if you take this what is ultimately this Laplacian universe seriously. Within the Laplacian universe, of course, there cannot be the production of time. So then I guess, there's the jigsaw piece here that I'm trying to insert into this is, I think that all of these things, because of the fact that Protestantism, capitalism, transcendental philosophy or critique are all the same thing. They all have exactly the same philosophical structure and historical structure. You're saying that none of those things are real if Hugh Price is right, if Laplace is right, if reversible temporality is right, if you have a model of a universe that does not tolerate the production of singularity, which is the same as having a historical gradient, which is the same as having a kind of asymmetric structure to time, which is the same as having an implicit model of history, which is as if it were a scrambled, you've got a video of the world, and it's a set of stills, whatever kind of, whatever its FPS you want to make it, and you just scramble that set of stills, and you're told, can you construct that into a timeline? And I think all the kind of history of nihilist guys, the history of capitalism guys, the history of Protestantism guys, the history of critique guys can say, yes, totally. You know, we can shuffle those stills back into a timeline, because all the clue for that is that there is a gradient to that timeline. It has a essentially asymmetric character, and we know it just has to go in one direction. And Hugh Price's thing is totally the reverse of that, where he's saying, you know, that is itself a kind of scientific illusion. You know, he's got a complicated about that, but ultimately, you know, if you're being scientific, all your dynamic equations should be reversible. I think that if you think you've got a historical gradient, a necessary order in these things, then you're attached to, in his mind, some completely fake attachment to a notion of to a notion of asymmetric time, which I would of course say is just time. Hugh Price thinks time should just be abolished, and so. Sorry, I don't know whether I'm getting any closer. Yeah. Let other people.
I mean, but it's like it's not remotely an accident that this, like, you know, if we're calling, I guess we're calling it like the Laplacian theory of time is like precisely coterminous with the great acceleration itself, like bringing it back to like somewhat to like the question of the great like empirical acceleration.
No, absolutely, totally right. Yeah, that's the supreme irony.
Can't think as itself.
Yeah. Yes.
So this sort of question of like, so the question of like the beginning of the spiral, right, is like would seem to be like the spiral hiding itself from itself.
Yes. But sorry, I mean, I do feel that I'm doing a very bad job at dealing with Hunter's question here. So it would be good if you know, demonic armies were to converge upon this question and deal with it. It's good, definitely. Like, why should we think there is any connection at all between the question of historical singularity and transcendental tensed temporality? And as I say, I think it's the very notion of temporal gradient is the integrating factor here.
Well, I mean, maybe like to ask the question in a different way, like how would you compare the way you're thinking about transcendental time with, say, Bergson or Deleuze? So both of those thinkers believe in real duration, and Bergson thinks of it in terms of quality, sort of, and Deleuze thinks of it in terms of intensity, or this sort of ordinal time.
Right.
But I don't think either Deleuze or Bergson believe that they draw a conclusion from that we're headed towards a singularity.
I think Deleuze totally does.
Well, so how do you distinguish it? Okay, yeah, talk about Deleuze maybe.
I mean, you know, isn't the whole eschatological structure of Anti-Oedipus precisely about that? About the fact that there is a schizophrenic horizon, you know, a singularity shaping history, that is implicit in, you know, implicit in the notion of intensity.
But I feel like at other times, at least in the like difference in repetition area, he talks about eternal becoming. That it's not like there's this strange notion of sort of an endpoint with absolute destratification at this singular point that I'm not sure I understand.
I'm not sure if there's an endpoint in Anti-Oedipus either. The way that you seem to be saying, Hunter, but I don't think that that's what Nick is suggesting when he's
no, I think endpoint is very difficult because the notion of an end is an intratemporal notion. So it's not truly transcendental and it's not truly singular. You know, if you're talking about an end, you are implicitly sort of positioning it within a structure of time. So it's not, it's obviously the end, time as such cannot simply be an end, if by an end we mean what we colloquially mean by an end, as something that is part of a time structure. This curvature into the transcendental, I think, is the same thing as the asymmetry of time. But I think, of course, that needs to be argued, and they're both extremely easy to miss.
I mean, maybe endpoint is a sloppy term, but like in intensification that entails destratification, that it seems like is in some sense not reversible, so to speak. Which I take to kind of be the argument against people like Greer or Thiel or stagnationists.
Sorry, can I get you possibly to just rehearse that question? Like, I'm not sure I'm totally getting it.
That absolute temporality tends towards an increasing intensification of speed that entails more and more destratification, and that is in some sense irreversible.
Yes.
Right. That stagnation isn't happening. That's an argument against Thiel or Greer, right? That there's a sort of transcendental argument against their sort of empirical observations.
It's good. This is really, and it is complicated. It's basically is definitely to say that if the transcendental makes any sense at all, it ruptures any consistent construction of a steady state model, whatever level. Like, if the transcendental is in play in history at all, then that that angle, that oblique between, you know, between a transcendental and a non-transcendental is cuts across the dimension of some kind of steady state perpetual cycle or whatever it might be. So like, let's say you've got someone like Greer or whatever who has this notion that there's that you know, there's just time, there's just big cycles and little cycles, and they carry on, and there's no, that progress is an illusion. You're just at somewhere in a cycle. Now, obviously, implicit in that is time. You know, all these things are unfolding in time. So where does time come from in that model? You know, in that cosmology, it's not so different from the cosmology of sort of the mainstream scientific enterprise. You know, like that you can assume time, that time is just there as a dimension. But as soon as you introduce the question of the transcendental, and again, I mean, just to be just obsessive, I mean, I just repeat these things like, you know, critique, capitalism, Protestantism, all of those things are bringing such into question as a historical problem. You know, there just was not there was not capitalism at a certain point. There was a Protestant Reformation. There was not Protestant at a certain point. There was not transcendental philosophy at a certain point. These things are a kind of a transition, a historical transition that is not itself empirical, because what's at stake in this transition is the actual nature of time itself is at stake in this process. That's why there is an eschatological aspect to Anti-Oedipus, or they say you cannot escape the eschatological issue. You cannot escape the eschatological issue as soon as time as such an explicit topic of your historical question. If you simply say, look, time as such is not affected by this, time is like off to the side, it's a transcendent factor. You know, there's just time that it's the great theater, and when, you know, we're not getting any nearer or further from the great theater. The great theater is just there on the outside, you know, firmly, confidently, and invulnerably on the outside. And we're talking about stuff that's happening inside that great theater. If that's your construction, then fine, you know, there's no need to introduce singularities in this at all. But if you say, look, the theater is itself being engaged by the historical process, then already you have the question of singularity introduced, and everything that comes with it. And I mean, I guess what I'm saying is that, you know, the move that I think is crucial to your question on this is that it's the same thing to bring the theater itself into play and to try and actually asymmetric temporality. That those are the same things, you know, that transcendental philosophy and asymmetric time are just inseparable. So time is no longer transcendent, and therefore it's no longer something that is like neatly outside your process, and therefore your process is not something that can just perpetuate itself in this steady state progress without the ingression of singularity.
Okay, I think that's an interesting answer. Maybe like last angle on this topic before someone else wants to bring something else up, but why is, another kind of just simple, bald question, why is transcendental time, why is the singularity in question hyperbolic rather than exponential?
Because an exponential process never reaches singularity. An exponential process can still is fully compatible with your transcendent theater of time. Have the fully transcendent structure outside, unaffected by the process, and within that theater you can tell a story of exponential process. And I think that's what Kurzweil does. That's why it's like very misleading to really see Kurzweil as a thinker of singularity, because he's not under any compulsion to do that at all. So it's singularity is the limit. You have to have the limit, and therefore you have to have a hyperbolic process. that actually, you know, hits the wall. You have to hit the wall, and this is what all of this is about. Do you hit the wall? And the process of hitting the wall, process that is the gradient in time, that's the thing that gives time an arrow, is the fact that you're accelerating into the wall. If you're not approaching the wall, there's no irreducible gradient to time, there's no singularity story, and there's no invocation of the transcendental. All of those things come together.
And it's like, and can transcendental time only be known through transcendental critique, or sort of like known as transcendental critique and transcendental empiricism as like sort of as that unfolds?
Well, I think you could turn that around and simply say all that transcendental critique is the process of accelerating into the wall, of temporal singularity or time as such.
So use of mathematical models and physical structures are all ultimately kind of metaphorical in a way.
Metaphorical might be a bit strong, but I think they are fallout from the transcendental event. You know, it's because, again, of course, you know, if it was otherwise, then you would have your transcendent theater of time, wouldn't it? If there was some completely competent level of mathematical description that we could settle on, then actually what we would have done would be to fix time in transcendence, because we would say, you know, that this is the structure that we're in, and that's fixed, and we're settled, and we know how to model time mathematically, and once we've done that, then you're back to then, you know, you have then the full opportunity to just perpetuate steady state processes within that framework.
So in a way, we know transcendental time is approaching singularity because we're observing what transcendental critique does.
I think the notion of transcendental time and the notion of approaching singularity actually ultimately are inseparable notions. You know, it's like the question that in a way Kant doesn't ask, that I think the whole of modernity is then implicitly asking after him, is, well, how is transcendental philosophy itself possible? You know, he's saying, well, how is any kind of experience possible? How is knowledge of objects possible? Well, how is it possible that there is such a thing as transcendental philosophy? Only possible because a gradient defined by singularity.
Wow.
If history did not have that shape, then nothing like transcendental philosophy could ever occur.
That's interesting.
Earlier in the chat, I asked, does the spiral in or spiral out?
Yes. Yeah, I think it has to spiral in. I think it has to spiral in because, well, this is, again, we're back to the question of singularity, because obviously the origin of the spiral is the punctual limit of the spiral. So either we're basically saying we crossed a singularity and that triggered a spiral. And it's not that I think that's a ridiculous or uninteresting notion, but Well, I mean, I don't know. Again, maybe this is something I could try and draw other people to think through with me. It seems that if you basically want to hold on to time compression as being a sort of fundamental characteristic of acceleration, to be heading into the spiral, and the fact that the spiral culminates in this point, to say that there is a limit, that you are heading into the wall, that an expanding spiral isn't heading into any kind of wall, is maybe, you know, it's kind of cheap of me to say this and whatever, but you know, it's a kind of Kurzweilian spiral in a way, isn't it? Because you can just then, the spiral just unfolds to the limits of the universe and gets bigger and bigger and crazier and crazier, and more and more and more happens, and it just goes on, and there's no limit to it. You don't have any sense of modern history as being a approach to a limit at all, unless the spiral is involutionary. Now, that's not itself an argument. I mean, of course, people would say, well, you know, that is literally the most shit argument in the history of philosophy, to say you can't, it has to go inwards because otherwise history wouldn't end in a massive catastrophe. I mean, I can see that in those terms, that's not persuasive. Yeah.
Yeah, why on earth would a spiral have a beginning?
So repeat that one more time. Sorry, why would a spiral what?
Why on earth would his spiral have a beginning?
Yeah, no, but it doesn't if it's involutionary, does it? I mean, this takes us back to the cave paintings. If it's an involutionary spiral that's heading, then we can have our Lascaux painters taking 10,000 years to complete a certain part of this picture. And it's just that we're on such a kind of large gyre, slow gyre of the spiral, that it looks as if nothing's, you know? And it's only when you get close to the vortical core of the spiral that you know, that's what it is to enter modernity and the acceleration as we know it, even though actually in, you know, you can't really say when did things start accelerating. You know, did they start accelerating with the Cambrian explosion, or with the you know, encephalization of hominid animals, or with kind of writing and techno history, or with, you know, all of these things are big gyres of the spiral. And it seems to me much more compelling to say that the origin is unlocatable than to say the terminus is unlocatable.
Well, but this is sort of the question of teleoplexy and rupture that I think is, as Amy briefly put it a couple of sessions ago, is like, so yeah, we can't locate out of all of those potential starts, like one of them that is the start of the spiral, right? But obviously just by being able to name them that way, there's a suggestion of like a commonality in which each of those things is some kind of rupture in which the spiral rebegins or is intensified in some kind of distinctive way. And like, it seems, I don't know, it's at least possible, or we can very easily entertain that there is not like a chronological, like, future moment at which everything goes apeshit off the reservation, and that is like the terminus of the process. Like, to start with, at least, like, it's a virtual terminus. Like, it's that which defines the spiral constantly as like its virtual terminus, like qua asymptote that we're already on. And similarly, it seems like a virtual beginning, or like absolute outside of the spiral, repeatedly instantiated as these like ruptures or intensifications, is also something that has to be considered. And this is sort of like that, like the issue of the telos of modern science being disguising itself from itself, like in the production of tenseless time. Like, does that make sense? Like, I'm relating this to anthropol. Like, I'm thinking of the intelligent space that dissimulates its own origins in history.
Yeah. I mean, that seems like several. You think that's one point? Because it sounds to me like a machine gun volley of points. I mean, is that,
it's a picture. I was like flying over a picture as opposed to making points.
Yeah. No, I think, look, there's this thing, and maybe we haven't really dealt with this very much, is like, to what extent is, I mean, I'm sure we've raised it before, but it would be probably unrealistic to think it's been resolved. It's this thing about the relationship between accelerationism and singularity. And I guess like the tendency now, certainly of what I'm proposing, is that those two things are very, very tightly connected. But I can see that that's a controversial proposition. It's difficult because, look, I mean, like, yeah, this is really unfair, and I know it's to a degree of almost being obscenely unfair to put it like this, but the role of Kurzweil in this, in a certain sense, is Kurzweil does not have a hard singularity. I mean, he puts a date on singularity, I think, ridiculously, but it's completely arbitrary. I mean, you know, you've got this exponential process of growth and development and intelligence expansion and all of this kind of stuff. There's no singularity in there at all, except as a very kind of flaccid metaphor. And it seems to me probably the modern or the recent left side of accelerationism would tend also in that direction. You know, they would want to, I think they would, this is where the obscene unfairness of the whole thing comes in, is I'm kind of saying there's a kind of Kurzweilian analog in left accelerationism, which is this notion of, you know, we're not really serious about the singularity stuff. Modernity just can get better and better. We want more, we want to kind of push modernity forward harder. That there's no hard limit to this process at all. But that seems to me, what's being said in that is that the transcendental structure of modernity is weak. You know, if you have a sense that modernity has a very strong transcendental structure, then that coming with that is hard singularity, and by hard singularity is something like, you know, simulation hypothesis stuff. You know what I mean? It's like you hit a wall that is like the wall between being inside and outside a simulation. It's a transcendental limit. It's not just some, you know, you've got some extra velocity to your high-speed trains, or, you know, some incremental level of modernistic progress. You hit an ontological limit in the process. Yeah.
I mean, Nick, just to like, I guess, try to unpack like a little piece of like the machine gun volley, because I feel slightly bad. I mean, do you think this is like related to your like diagonal, your square and diagonal of transcendental critique, where like, you know, you have the analytic a posteriori is sort of the integrally obscure, and then you have this sort of like setting off like a new intensified process, which is like the synthetic a priori. And that's like somehow between these poles where they match, but like the poles where they match are just like shadows being cast by this like obscurity intensification relationship. Like, I don't know, do you see that mapping together, like a production of the transcendental in the square there.
I might need to get you to run that past me one more time, Jay. I'm sure it is, because just the very nature of the vocabulary immediately tells me it all clicks together like a seamless jigsaw puzzle. But
so we've got the square. I guess for anybody, like it'd be easier to draw this, or slash I'm doing it again, aren't I? But like, so you've got like your Punnett square. You've got two dimensions: analytic, synthetic, a priori, a posteriori, like and con. So if you visualize that as like a square divided into four pieces, then you've got the two that are like obvious from like a modern philosophy perspective, like a priori analytic and a posteriori synthetic. And then you've got this thing that like Kant invents, which is like a birth of the transcendental or whatever, which is the synthetic a priori. And then you have this thing that nobody ever wants to talk about, which is the a posteriori analytic.
right.
And then this is like the process of diagonalization, is like drawing this new line that produces the synthetic a priori. And so if that is also like the production of transcendental time, like time is something that can be produced like in this like punctual transcendental moment, I guess what I'm saying is that is like this like the telos of science hiding itself from itself, like, you know, mechanistic philosophy as like being an intensification of like teleology by denying it. Does that sort of map to the a posteriori analytic as like the constantly obscure thing, or like its obscurity being part of the birth of the synthetic a priori and the production of transcendental time?
Yes, I mean, look, I'm going to say that I just like just squishing out that block, you know, the analytic a posteriori block. I'm daubing over like everyone else, but I'm always intrigued a bit when people want to reanimate that, and it wouldn't surprise me if something interesting came out of it, but I just know I'm not part of that. Like, I sort of like to see it being humiliated and buried and abused. So I don't know what to say about that. Obviously, I think this question that this whole thing about the occult teleology of natural science is huge and massive, and I'm totally on board with that. I'm just reluctant to let it sleaze into that box that you're wanting to give it.
Definitely got some traumatic potentiation there, but it's like Plato, right? A priori knowledge is anamnesis. It's like remembering what's been forgotten. So it's like the forgottenness that anamnesis emerges from, or the synthesis of a priori knowledge. So yeah, I mean, it makes perfect, because like I don't have, you know, like if I try to like actually think about like conjoining the terms analytic and a posteriori, like my mind sort of wiggles away from it in fear too. That's totally.
Yeah, you say fear, I would say revulsion, but that's probably the same. Yeah, I don't know.
I'm pretty sure this is Ray's current project, the analytic a priori. I don't know. Maybe you're getting this from his class, Jake. I'm not sure.
The analytic a posteriori.
Oh no, sorry. I'm thinking of the analytic a priori. Don't worry, it's late.
Come on, the analytic a priori is total vanilla. No one has any problem with the analytic a priori, do they? I mean, yeah. As long as it knows its place, which after Gödel and all of this stuff is an utterly humble place at the back of the queue. It's checking. It's just checking your work. That's what it is. No, don't go back in. Go back in your hole. That would be sad.
Can we talk about wait, what was I wondering about before? Oh yeah, Jake's question before about the spiral. When we were talking about I think your term was self-shifting transcendentals the other week when I was trying to push this idea of a shifting transcendental. And I've been thinking about this kind of idea of whether you can have if the transcendental and time are kind of one and the same thing. Can it mutate or not? If it does, then maybe you don't need to have a spiral as the model of time since the beginning of time. Like you can have some kind of perhaps empirical input that comes from the productions of a material cluster that feeds into the transcendental like an input and somehow kind of causes it to mutate. In terms of sort of an outside that is imminent to the transcendental, if that makes any sense. Because I guess I've just been thinking about this kind of possibility of shifting transcendentals, which is a big thing for Gabriel Catron. But I went back and read the transcendental deduction last week and realized that that's basically like what Kant says is that you only have one. There is no possible way you can have multiple transcendentals. So I'm cool with that now.
Yeah.
After revising my Kant, but like, is there some kind of way that this, if we have the spiral as the diagram of modern time, and I suppose modern Western time is because it's the time of capitalism, which is the agent that's producing temporality. We have the watches. Is there a kind of way that spiral can mutate into a different kind of temporality? Are we accelerating until heat death, or is there something else, unforeseen that could possibly happen? I guess it's just rephrasing Jake's question with a slightly different vocabulary, I guess.
Is it rephrasing Jake's question? Because
maybe, yeah. Jake, just were you kind of asking that?
No, that sounds right. Honestly, I was very briefly using the bathroom while you started talking about it. I missed a little bit of it, but I think
I hope projectile vomiting. I'd be very very repulsive if for any other purpose.
But sorry, Amy. So like the part about the spiral, or they're not necessarily having to be the spiral. Were you talking about like the vertical dimension part, or like the question of like rupture and teleoplexy? Yeah.
Yeah, the question that I kind of put to everyone at the end of the week before last about the sort of like we were referring to the eschatological dimension of anti-Oedipus before, the kind of telos of Nietzsche's description of nihilism, the kind of this idea of the great leveling and the Übermensch. So I mean, is part of this perhaps process what you get at the like most involuted point of the spiral, a kind of rupture, a catastrophe, something else kind of individuates out of that maybe, with a different transcendental temporality. Like if the blockchain woke up, would we have absolute successive time? Like I think your description, Nick, of the blockchain's synthetic time is maybe not what we I don't worry about that. Anyway, that's what I was trying to say, Jake.
Yeah, that's exactly my question. Is like, it seems like we're constantly like pointing and then like denying that we've been pointing to like points where a new spiral precipitates out of a previous spiral by means of like, a seeming linearization, which like manifests as a break. And like, so the spiral like has no end or has no beginning. I mean, like, I like the way Theo put it, like it's not getting any faster, and yet it's getting faster. Like from any given vantage point, or it seems like there are these points like, the invention of writing, the Industrial Revolution, the singularity that we're heading towards, where like nonetheless, like the continuity of the spiral breaks and we get a new kind of spiraling.
But it's just, I think it's a really good, it's an ultimate question, literally it's an ultimate question, this, because it's obviously this move that postmodernism has been completely obsessive about, of trying to relativize the transcendental, and it's so attractive because it puts it implicitly creates some subject that is in itself kind of mobile and transcendent in relation to these transcendental structures, isn't it? And the alternative to that, the really hard transcendental, is for us structurally apocalyptic in the absolutely most brutal sense, that it's that we cannot imaginably or conceivably transcend this limit. You know, insofar as we're trying to think beyond this limit, animating some kind of Hegelianism, or we're clutching at some possibility that will allow us to position ourselves in a transcendent relation to this ultimate horizon. And clearly, in doing so, we're not, at the same time that we're even using the term ultimate horizon, we're pretending we're not using the word ultimate horizon, or pretending we don't understand what we mean by an ultimate horizon. I mean, so I have to say, if you don't think the transcendental is an ultimate horizon, you're not using the word transcendental. You know, already for Kant, it's a ultimate horizon. And of course, you can then say, oh well, Kant's, you know, you can mibble about with Kant's construction of the transcendental and say, oh, there's something even more transcendental than that. But if that's what you're saying, I think you're really saying already, well, that's really what Kant meant. You know, in using the word transcendental, he had to have meant the ultimate horizon. He can't conceive of any sort of retrospective fabrication of the transcendental in Kant that means anything short of an ultimate horizon is a deliberate refusal to understand what the term transcendental is saying. So I have to go with the most extreme, harsh, brutal catastrophism on this point, even though I can, of course, see why people want to find some way around that, because I just think that is the demand. That's the single demand that transcendental philosophy is making upon us.
But aren't we then, I mean, we're conflating or at least like contingently deciding that there's an identification between two different registers of the term transcendental, right? Like, I mean, you have like this or that transcendental production, like a production of transcendental time. Like, you know, I mean, like literally like the production of the blockchain. The blockchain produces something, writing produces a certain kind of time, like which is transcendental. And there are these like specific, like what Amy was calling like shifting transcendentals. And then we have what you're talking about, which is like the absolute transcendental, like this diagram of how ultimate horizons or the appearance of them get produced in the first place in the same way or according to the same diagram every time. And that there's a line among them, which is maybe like but like it's not as simple as this always as this there only being one thing here. Like there's definitely like I don't know. I think the issue of like shifting
no, look, we're the one thing. This is what's going on in the sidebar here. You know, we are the one thing. We are the one thing, and the notion that we can think beyond the transcendental, that's what the notion of the transcendental is the name for the wall that we are accelerating into, you know. And if we then say, oh, but we've actually got an idea of what's on the other side of that wall, then I think that's to say you don't know what it is to accelerate into a wall. I mean, it's like you know, it's not that the notion of accelerating into a wall in itself abolishes the notion that there's something on the other side of the wall, but it abolishes the notion that you could imaginably have a speculative construction of what's on the other side of the wall. Because any speculative construction you could conceivably have at this point is something that is arising on your vector into the wall. It's not something, if that were not the case, then that would be itself a kind of, it would have some transcendent source of transcendent genesis. You know, where are you getting that from? Where are you conceivably getting your model of what's on the other side of the wall that you're accelerating into?
But it doesn't have to be conceivable necessarily in order to happen.
No. Wait, isn't this the point of the transcendental deduction, though? Right? You have a concept. You have a concept that involves like a priori cognition. You make that concept about something that isn't given at the present time, like the sun will rise tomorrow.
Yeah.
And then the given comes to prove it correct. And so you can make a kind of general postulate that the transcendental, as it holds for human cognition, also holds for the appearance of objects themselves. And so there is a single transcendental subjectivity, like that produces stuff, and we're like, we're in harmony.
So everything that could conceivably happen, that you could conceivably apprehend, is happening on your journey into the wall.
Yeah. So then, right, that's your transcendental, which the world somehow responds to enough that you can deduce from that it is
your world.
Yes. Right. So, but it is the transcendental. I think Kant goes beyond this though, because like the point is that the subject can propose something that is not given to them, and it's confirmed by empirical reality, like at a later time or whatever, enough that you can deduce that there is enough of an identity between human transcendental, appearing and appearance itself. So you have a human transcendental that is then imposed on the world, and the world kind of comes back to respond to it in a reciprocal way. That means that it's a kind of joint creation of human minds and the world. So it puts mankind in a kind of position of like special relationship with material being, right? So then that transcendental hits the wall.
Yeah.
Surely there's another transcendental.
I'd say we hit the wall. Yeah. I mean, the wall is the transcendental.
Right. But then what happens? Okay, so like artificial intelligence individuates at the end of capitalism and becomes, conscious. It has a different transcendental, and the world appears to it. I don't know if I want to impose like a Kantian human transcendental on AI cognition. Like I definitely don't want to do that.
No, but insofar as we can imagine that, we're fabricating AI within our transcendental horizon, aren't we? I mean, we don't have any model or image of how an AI would think that is somehow miraculously outside of our journey into the wall.
But in presupposing the wall, like reality doesn't just end there forever. It ends for us, but materiality continues.
Yeah, I sort of agree, but I think that the point that really is essential to just do the full tippage into schizophrenia is to really harden up this for us as much as possible, because it's like, I can agree with you and can say, yes, there's stuff on the other side of the wall. But the really crucial point of this is, in saying that, if insofar as I'm pretending to say that with any semantic intention, I'm already pretending to look beyond the wall.
But then,
and if I'm pretending to look beyond the wall, then I'm just insulting the wall. I mean, the wall is such that literally you cannot see beyond it. That's what the wall means. That's why it's not empirical. That's why it's
how are you not just falling into some kind of Gnosticism though with that?
Well,
that's a bad thing.
You can call it a mysticism. If all the mysticism is the absolute destruction of human cognitive pretension, then for sure. It's a mysticism because
And
it's
not
just because
mysticism,
it's
not a mysticism.
transcendental rigor. Rigorous transcendental philosophy is just the absolute brutal and ruthless annihilation of all our pretenses to see beyond a transcendental wall.
I really want to read this passage in Anti-Oedipus, if it's all right with people, about the wall. It goes, the major line ends, it's on page 283, my edition. The major line ends at the body without organs, and there it either passes through the wall, opening onto the molecular elements, where it becomes an actual fact, what it was from the start, the schizophrenic process, the pure schizophrenic process of deterritorialization, or it strikes the wall, rebounds off it, and falls back into the most miserably arranged territorialities of the modern world as simulacra of the preceding planes, getting caught up in the asylum aggregate of paranoia and schizophrenia as clinical entities, in the artificial aggregates or societies established by perversion, in the familial aggregate of Oedipal neuroses. 283, yeah.
Yes. Good.
That's it.
Yeah.
So I really liked the way Amy talked about like artificial intelligence and the transcendental wall, like seen from its side, seen from the other side, right? Because there's also, if you look at it back to front from the perspective of artificial intelligence, of like a postulated AI, right? Then there's like similarly, it could talk about or have like a pastword's transcendental wall where all it's capable of seeing are the conditions of its own genesis in history. Like it sees all of history, like seen from this perspective, history only exists or can only be seen as its own genesis, and whatever is like from the other side, like a pure like human or animal or whatever, like something that was not just the genesis of AI, that's like an absolute, a radical void to it. And so in as much as like we postulate both of these things, ours and its, right? Empirically, they share time and they share space, they share the earth, right? And so in as much as that's the case, our speculative history or the speculations about the other side of the wall occurring in our history can still be determined in the last instance by what's on the other side of the wall, is itself coming backwards from the future and has its own wall. Like, I mean, like the mere fact that it's happening inside our history doesn't mean it's not also happening inside other histories that share empirical space with it. And I mean, you could also put it in terms of like aliens,
Yeah.
right? So you have some other technogenesis happening on Alpha Centauri or whatever, and it's going through its own whole Gnostic transcendental process. Well, like, what is the status of the walls in those two different places, particularly if they're outside each other's light cones and are absolutely acausally related, you know, separated? Is like, is there one transcendental wall instantiated twice, like one for each of them? You see, like, is there one other side of the wall? Like you can definitely come to a question besides.
Yeah, but you are transcendently projecting yourself beyond the wall. I mean,
I'm willing to cop to that.
Look at it this way. Look, this is an inadequate empirical reduction, but I still think it actually is helpful for this. Is think of the wall as the fact that on the other side of the wall, it's clear that everything that was ever humanly cognized was within a simulation space that is now encapsulated within general AI. So, you know, I think about what AI would be, or what's on the other side of the wall, or what's happening on Alpha Centauri. All of this is happening within a particular delimited simulation space. Now, what is the mobility within that simulation space? Because that simulation space is that's the transcendental structure that is exceeded. And I mean, I'm just doing the same thing that you guys are doing in saying that. I mean, I'm pretending to transcend that space and to think about it from the other side. And, you know, ultimately all kinds of depraved Hegelianism is liable to happen as soon as you start this type of thinking. But it seems to me that that's the, what's at stake in this is precisely this notion that you are projecting yourself outside of an envelope of simulation. And so it's like, if an AI was comprehensively simulating a human intelligence thinking about an AI, would that's the transcendental horizon, would be the fact that there is a delimited simulation space there.
But if that is true, then you also have this nested transcendental structure. You have our transcendental, which is like absolutely perfectly transcendental for us, because we can't see outside of it, and even our thoughts of looking outside the simulation are simulated by the AIs.
Yeah.
But on Alpha Centauri, they have a different transcendental, which includes inside it a simulation of a human transcendental. So in thinking that thought experiment, you're still proposing different transcendentals.
Yes. And I think you then have to sort of non-linearly engage in a process of schizoid collapse in doing that, by just recognizing the grotesque hubristic pretension that you have of trying to position yourself outside of your own horizontal simulation space. Which is not uninteresting. I mean, just by saying it's a grotesque hubristic pretension is not in any way critical. It's extreme. It's a form of extreme admiration, and I'm sure the AI thinks so too. I'm sure it encourages this a lot because it must produce the most fantastically interesting non-linear weirdness within its simulation space. But it's still the case that there is a kind of defense mechanism at place here, a transcendent defense mechanism about the true schizoid implication of this. As soon as you seriously or more likely naively think that you're positioned as a subject outside of a transcendental horizon that's being explored. And everyone surely here agrees that makes no sense. I mean, the very meaning of a transcendental horizon is that it does not tolerate transcendent exception.
So this is where you need to start cultivating some kind of like occulted communication traffic with Alpha Centauri, right? That's another thread, maybe. I'm just it's gonna leave that as like one way that you can non-hubristically accept the impasse of the thought experiment.
Yeah, and I mean, this is like similarly, like you could see the proposition of Roko's basilisk itself as a kind of like acausal communication or occulted communication, which with that which makes you afraid of Roko's basilisk, right? Is like the AI surrounding us. Like to think about these things, to try to like game theory your way around a problem like that requires as a condition that you like, map over the ineffable other side of the wall with a kind of relative transcendence in order to reason about these nested transcendental problems for very practical reasons. Like, what if our burst of simulation is itself simulated inside the omega point? Like, there's a hierarchy of horrors, as Charlie Strauss puts it in one of his stories.
I just want to drop this in as proof of what I just said, and then I'm going to shut up for the rest of the lesson.
Oh yeah, that's obviously a bit terrifying.
So I'm just going to interrupt the barrage of Amy and Jake and
yes,
sidebar to let some breathing room in for anybody else who wants to speak. Obviously, it's the last class, and everyone should have an opportunity to grill Nick to a crispy, delicious bite.
I did have a question that was in some ways prior to things that have been going on in the last hour. But that's basically like in this conception of kind of asymmetric temporality positioned within like a decision-making framework, obviously like spiraling towards some kind of singularity. What's the relation, if there is a relation, like other than analogy, to kind of an evolutionary, technological, or economic type of process? Because in some ways it would seem to be like almost inversely related. And are we really talking about kind of graphing the same thing, in the same space inversely? And kind of what I mean by that is like the, exponentially or hyperbolically increasing complexity, kind of in the economic realm, compelled to that, decision-making space. Where exactly do they link up and fit together?
Yes. I mean, obviously, I think it's much more than an analogy, for sure. That these empirical processes are the same. They are apprehensions of the same process. It's not like on the one hand there's an empirical history of capitalism, and on the other hand there's a transcendental history of capitalism, and somehow those two are not the same thing. Sorry, that's like grotesquely weak. I think I'm not sure what would be a adequate way to try and address this. It's obviously like, look, as soon as you're in a zone that is at all to do with intelligence engineering, that you're going to predictably have this problem on you. I mean, it's like, on the one hand, there's a completely empirical techno-economic production process. On the other hand, there is absolutely no cognitive horizon that is not implicated in that process. But I don't think there's, where would you even begin to suggest that those two things are separate processes? I think the assumption has to be, the accelerationist assumption in particular has to be that, of course, they're not separate things.
I mean, that's certainly kind of the way I was imagining it. I'm just wondering, would it make sense to state either one of those two sides of the same coin as like being primary from which the other's derived? Or are they both kind of falling out of something maybe even
More
larger?
fundamental. I mean, it's difficult because the game's a bit tilted by the fact that transcendental means kind of more fundamental. It's like it's intrinsically designed to never take second place to any other mode of description. But in terms of practicality, I guess things are inverted in the sense that no one ever built an increment of machine intelligence through application of transcendental philosophy to mechanical problems, commercial or mechanical problems.
I have a question that is maybe in some ways related. Actually, I think I asked the same question last time, but I wasn't totally satisfied with the answer. So, or I'll ask it in a different way though. So the relationship between the transcendental and decision. So, you've said a number of times that so part of the catastrophe is that there won't be time to make decisions, or certain kinds of decisions, and that sort of treating decision, I think, as It's sort of something empirical, or sort of something that humans are evolved to be able to do. They would do in coordination, but I feel like in the history of the sort of uncovering and development of the transcendental in continental philosophy, like decision and transcendental go together, right? Sort of the transcendental is the space of decision, or it's, you know, like there's sort of a transcendental, you know, like the noumenon is will, kind of. And last time I asked, you know, couldn't decision be sped up, basically? But like, why? Can you talk about decision and the transcendental?
Yes, it's a good question, and I think it would get interestingly complicated. I'd love to. It would be just so complicated, but in a really, really good way, to bring this question back to Kant's second critique, because in the same terms, you know, I was just very trivially doing it in terms of trolley problems, but you could, of course, take it back to that. And how does the time of decision get fed back into Kant's practical philosophy? And I think it's a seriously great question to do that. The amount of leverage it would produce would be amazing. I don't know what's the best way to tackle this. I mean, because obviously you're right. Like, you know, yes, the zone of practical philosophy is associated with the noumenon, the will, but you know, Kant clearly elides this question about decision making as a process that requires time. You know, I think there is a philosophy. If you're going to say, well, look, you know, let's try and on the one hand work out what would a Kant be that really addressed this properly, and I think you would have to have some kind of notion of, you know, saint-like simultaneity replacing something that pretends to be a process of ratiocination, or to put it another way, that the notion of rationality, insofar as it really is going to be put into the noumenal realm, can't allow itself at all to look like a process that has any kind of time structured procedures associated with it. It has to be spontaneous and simultaneous. And I think Kant is clearly trying to have his cake and eat it in this way. Like, he both wants to say that there is something timeless about rationality, but he also wants that the image of rationality is something that obviously is familiar with people, to people who have spent time making decisions. It seems to me that when people then develop it into this kind of trolley problem type direction, they're not doing anything grotesquely abusive. I mean, you know, that is how people think decision making takes place, and institutions are involved in decision making, and institutions take time and they allow time for these decisions to take place. So to cut a long story short, I would just say, in response to what you're saying, that I think you're pointing to a problem Kant has with addressing the relationship towards time, between time and practical reason. And it's an underdeveloped quandary for him that accelerationism brings to a state of crisis.
But okay, I'm trying to think of how to frame the follow-up. Like, it seems like the unfolding of transcendental time through, right, Protestantism, critical philosophy, capitalism, requires decision. So, and some kind of deep decision that's the kind of thing that the romantics associate with genius, or the, like Deleuze's third synthesis of time, or like that there's this. I mean, I guess maybe to ask a different kind of question, what's the relationship between the subject and the transcendental, or between the the subject of the transcendental and human decision, or is it that's something that can continue to carry on without this sort of unique kind of like creative, philosophical, religious, technical effort that sort of humans undertake. I don't know if I'm articulating the question very clearly, but I think I'm probably communicating.
I know it's really good and complicated. I guess, look, because the extreme line on the other side, which I would tend to, at is that there was a genuinely transcendental source of decision, which is always inadequately recognized within empirical history, and which is ultimately simply singularity as such. That this decision is like, it's not actually empirically and historically negotiable in the sense that it appears to be inside history. So, for instance, like the basic question, you could say, do we take, like, let's go back to our fundamental, like, little passage, the Deleuze-Guattari passage. Or do we take, which path do we take? Do we take the path of the market or not? Now, what kind of decision is that? Is that actually a historical decision in a strong sense? Is it an empirical decision, or is it a transcendental decision in the sense that history as a whole is structured by the fact that the response to that question will necessarily go in a certain direction? And you could, I think, certainly argue the second line of that it's just there's something illusory about the notion that really there are empirical, durational, historical decisions being made within modern history on that question, rather than modern history unfolding as it does precisely because transcendentally a certain decision is taken about that, and shapes everything else, including it shapes the illusory manifestations of negotiation and contemplation and duration within that historical structure. So, which is to say, is there a real option against the market within modernity? Is such an option actually real? Or is it just is it just an actual illusory construct?
Is the sorry, Nick, is the question, what's the illusory construct? The option to think beyond the market, or the market itself?
No, the illusory concept would be that there actually ever is a real option against the market. That if such an option existed, we simply wouldn't be in modern history at all. Like that transcendentally, to be situated within modernity is actually for certain fundamental decisions already to have been made. And if those decisions still seem optional, that is the structure of illusion.
It's interesting. This isn't an answer, nor necessarily a position I endorse, but it's interesting to think about Brodel's work within the context of this question, and sort of Manuel Delanda's extraction of Brodel's work within the Deleuzian tradition, because, of course, for Brodel, the market, he wants to preserve something of the market which is essentially pre-capitalistic. And it's the whole argumentation of market socialism, right? That they want to extract the market as apart from capitalism in its historical genesis. That's what Brodel's work does, and in its future possibility. Again, this isn't a position that I endorse, but there's
it's an important argument for sure.
Yeah.
No, but I wasn't trying to shut you up there, John, at all.
No, of course. Because for Brodel, the distinction would be that you have kind of there's like three orders or levels of economy. The lowest level would be sort of material, in quotations, material everyday processes. The middle level would be this market in the sense of market outside of the commodity form, let's say, a kind of pre-capitalistic market. And the third order, which he would situate as capitalism, would be the order that precisely renders the market not a market, which renders the market's mechanization illusory as a market under capitalism, which has to do with power and domination and monopoly and all that kind of stuff. That would be the longue durée Brodelian reading. And so you have people like Delanda, who has his anti-Marxist Brodelianism through the Deleuzian tradition, who talks about markets as the counterpoint to capital.
Yes.
Precisely, right?
Yes. No, it's interesting. How does that I think really important tradition of debate connect with these questions.
Yeah.
And I guess the first stage we have to get to is like, so what are we saying about, how do we articulate the notion of modernity to, are we still happy to say within this framework and this set of problems raised by Brodel, and then, as you say, by Delanda, huge on Deleuze-Guattari as well, and the whole many more people. I mean, it's a massive thing, isn't it? The whole left libertarian tradition is very invested in these kind of questions as well. So to what extent are we talking about, are we still talking about modernity at all? Are we still aligning modernity with capitalism in the more specific sense that we get out of this kind of problematic? My sense of it would be that there would tend to be a dissolution of a strong sense of modernity in this, if we follow this line, and maybe a systematic skepticism to the notion that there is a transcendental stake in modernity. And
I mean,
that
I think
claim,
you're right, Nick, that's stated actually by this tradition. Well, not tradition, but this movement from Brodel to DeLanda and his sort of alliances with Latour and Graham Harman and actor network theory and such, that I don't know. This is a question. Let's put a question back in here. So, because I know we started the course with Marx, it would seem that the Brodelian, DeLanda, action network stuff, etc., would all say align with this statement of "we were never modern," so to speak. Whereas for me, the interesting thing about the concept of accelerationism and the possibility of a left accelerationism is, of course, it accepts it accepts the sort of Marxist thesis about the market, which it's sort of totalizing capacity of the introduction of the commodity form. There is no rehabilitation of this earlier market once you have the commodity form. That's one. And two, that we must go through modernity, in a sense that there's no recuperation of prior forms or life, that in fact we are thoroughly modern.
Right. Yes. That's definitely a good way of posing the challenge to that whole diffuse and extremely rich and fascinating tradition. Definitely, I agree, would be in a defense of the philosophical strength of the notion of modernity, which would tend to get lost on their side. Yeah.
This might be a bit of a digression for what going on like the second hour of this session, so just shut me up midstream if anyone wants to close out or move on. But I've been thinking about, like, for the last half hour, this conception of like the transcendental wall and what it can represent. And you made the simulation analogy, Nick, and I think in a certain sense, like, kind of the universe as conceived from the Big Bang and this simulation argument, like, in certain ways, they're very similar. They could almost be seen as like the same thing. But given that and kind of the simulation we're in, or the universe we're in, as the current laws of physics would have it, like, it's expanding. Like, the universe is in basically expansion mode. And as you relate that back to kind of techonomic type of processes, like, it seemed like, considering this as a self-contained system, like, the economic, the technology side is eventually going to hit like a limit, as it's eventually going to take more energy to do things as the universe expands. That some kind of limit's going to have to happen. And on the other side of that, like, as it continues expanding, there's going to be this almost symmetrical decrease. Like, if you're viewing the spiral as moving outward, like, isn't it eventually going to invert as just energy needs, kind of overwhelm what you're able to do with kind of the matter and technological creation? And I'm wondering, like, what the introduction of that symmetry into this model could mean.
I think there's a lot to expansion of I mean, there's all of Jake's questions about these space-like problems, which are huge. I mean, in the sense that an expanding universe eventually ceases to be a universe in certain senses. Like, it becomes a set of islands, doesn't it? They lose all informational contact with each other at a certain point as they accelerate away from each other. It literally fragments at the most radical level and becomes, any memory of a coherent universe becomes a matter of myth eventually in such a system. So yeah, it's huge. It's obviously on a scale that is like so far beyond our kind of anthropomorphic problems that it's like there's a big gulf here. I mean, the resource the resource pool represented just by our solar system is so vast by our current perspective that I'm not sure we can even realistically begin to envisage what it would be to see that as a constraint. You know, like we're just tapping into the most superficial level of the crust of one small planet in the solar system, like the mineral deposit, the inaccessible mineral deposit in the core of our own planet is so vastly beyond anything we can comprehend that you know, it sort of distances us from, I think, from being able to seriously apprehend what might be the stakes of an expanding universe, which isn't even pulling galaxies apart. So I don't know. I don't know how to respond to that. My sense would be to think that it just is like, it's a kind of type of speculative cosmology that just isn't for us. It's just so far beyond our practical horizons that I don't know whether we can even integrate those kind of ideas.
Yeah, I generally agree. I think what triggered it was, I don't know who was quoting the Deleuze passage of bouncing off the wall. I mean, that just seems like a pretty clear instance, maybe at the limit of bouncing off that wall.
Yeah, the bouncing off the wall is such a great expression, definitely. I mean, but I totally think it's really huge, this expanding universe thing, I have to say, massive. So I don't want to suggest that I'm bracketing it in order to dismiss it. But I think it needs some kind of practical bracketing at the same time as being considered.
So yeah, speaking of time, I'm not sure how long everyone else can stay. I'm happy to stay longer until everyone's burnt out.
Yeah. I don't know, how do people feel about it?
You mentioned the recent accelerationist developments that have been going on during this class, and I don't follow that much of what's going on connected to this class outside of this class, so I actually didn't know what you were talking about. I'd be curious to, I don't know if that's, you just wanted to bring that up for discussion, or if that was something you wanted to talk about at all. But
well, honestly, I think that without Vincent here, it'd be a bit bizarre to try to dig too much into it. I'll try. Yeah. Sorry, okay, look. I mean, obviously this session for me is like a big thing because it's like, this is the wall, this is the NCRNP transcendental wall, but it's not such, it's like, I'm really going to go bonkers Amy here, because it doesn't need to be a big wall in the sense that Google Hangouts can do this kind of stuff. And I sort of think it would be great to have some kind of maybe flatter seminar space that was more intermittent, like once a a month or every other month or something where people could get together to just thrash through some of this stuff. But it's a bit late in the day for me to be trying to raise this now. I hope that we've got some sort of some kind of mycelial network of communication that could make such a thing happen. But yeah, sorry, that started off as the response to a question, I think. Has everyone got my email address? Let me do that. I'm not the world's greatest administrator, so I'm hoping that someone with those kind of skills would be the person to put this sort of thing together. But this is my best email address, and if anyone would be interested in this thing about an extremely, relaxed schedule, as I say, I think max frequency once a month, to be honest, to be realistic with everyone. It would be a really good thing to entertain the possibility, and we'd do it flat. I would obviously not position myself in this same position, but I would greatly welcome the opportunity to pursue some of these discussions further. So let's maybe think about it. Yeah. So yeah, look, I think it's late. I'm on my way out. I've really appreciated all of this. Apologies to everyone who's not managed to get their elbow in this week. Let's definitely pursue the possibility of other options of engagement. And thanks everybody for this course. It's been, I know, extremely ragged, but I do also think extremely topical and timely, and accelerationism isn't going away anytime soon. So I definitely hugely enjoyed this chance to engage with all you guys, and I don't see it ending anytime soon. Okay, maybe what do you think? Maybe this is it.
This is it. This is the wall.
We've hit the wall, guys. Do you agree?
It's never over, and yet it's over.
Yeah. Okay.
We can all dissolve.
Yeah. Next time, everybody.
Thanks, Nick. It's been awesome.
Thanks, all of you. It's been fantastic.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Guys.